Authority. RWA is the lead on the water main project, and we're here to provide you with some information as to what the scope of that project is. I mentioned I'm Ryan Jackie, and my name's up there. I do legislative affairs, but also on our team is Jim Piper, our executive director. He sends his regrets. He wasn't able to make it today. Trevor Joseph, who you're going to be hearing from in a little bit, who's manager of technical services. And we also have on our team some consultants from Stantec and Ibrahim Kadam Consulting. Ibrahim is you can see one of our consultants, but also on the Stantec team is Vanessa Nishikawa, Abby Keller, Heather Waldrop, who you'll be hearing from here in just a second, and Michael Badianthes. A little bit about who RWA is, and then we're going to pass it over to Heather. So RWA is a joint powers association comprised of over 20 drinking water suppliers in the greater Sacramento area. You can see on that map on the right there some of the scope of area that RWA members encompass. RWA's mission, as you can see up there on the screen, is to serve and represent and align the interests of those members and stakeholders for the purpose, of improving water supply reliability, availability, quality, and affordability. And we will get into here why we believe the water bank will help advance that mission. And with that, I'm going to pass it on over to Heather.
Hi, thank you for coming. So for tonight's agenda, we're going to talk about meeting logistics, main purpose, why you're here, and then I'm going to pass it over to Trevor, and he'll talk about what a water bank is. And then he'll drill down and talk about what the Sacramento Regional Water Bank is, touch a little bit on thorough acknowledgement of the water bank, and then I'll pick it back up and we'll go through the environmental process. So for meeting logistics, first of all, if you haven't signed in, please do. We want to have a record of your attendance as well as include you on our distribution list if you'd like to continue receiving information. Please, of course, silence your cell phones. And if you'd like to speak tonight, a speaker card is helpful for us to know who you are and what your topic may be, and a record of your attendance as well. The presentation is going to be about 30 minutes with some time for questions and answers, as well as receiving public comments. And then there's an open house, and you can learn more about the water bank if we haven't answered all your questions through the presentation. So the purpose that you're here is we are conducting a scoping meeting for the environmental impact report. The Regional Water Authority is proposing to establish the Sacramento Regional Water Bank and has determined that an environmental impact report is needed to analyze the potential impacts of implementation of the project. And so scoping is an important part of that process, and that's the purpose of the meeting tonight. And the purpose of scoping is, number one, it's required. As part of CEQA, when you prepare an EIR, scoping is a required process in order to provide an overview of the project to the general public and provide an opportunity to get information from the public or comments about the scope and content of the EIR. Once we receive those comments, we'll gather that, consider it for inclusion and discussion in the environmental impact analysis as well as the report. So I'm going to pass it over to Trevor, and he'll talk about what a water bank is.
Great, thank you. Thanks. I'm going to try to read the slides in the back too as a teleprompter here. So that works. Great, yeah. So thank you again. My name is Trevor Joseph. I'm with the Regional Water Authority, and I'm the project manager for the Water Bank project. First, I'm going to touch on what is a water bank, giving some background here in terms of just a little bit of the science and the context for actually then introducing the Sacramento Regional Water Bank, then describe that project in a summary of slides, then I'll touch on federal acknowledgement and what that means for the Sacramento Regional Water Bank, and then I'll turn it back over to Heather for items 5 and 6. So, what is a water bank? Water banks recharge and store water, surface water, underground on behalf of specific parties. So the image that you can see there, the 2 images, the one in the center depicts surface water being stored underground. There's already groundwater beneath our feet in this region, below the North and South American groundwater subbasins, and I'll describe that in just a minute. And then that water can later be recovered, that stored groundwater, through wells and served for beneficial uses. So the mechanisms in which that's done, I'll also describe that in just a minute and go through some more detail. One of the key elements of a water bank is that they require formal accounting systems to really keep track of balances of how much you deposit or store, and then how much you recover. We often use a banking analogy, very similar to that concept of making deposits in a bank and then later withdrawals, but you don't want to over withdraw your accounts, and the same applies here as it relates to the water bank. So balances are drawn down during dry times as water is withdrawn, and balances increase during wet times as water is deposited. Again, I'll touch on how that's done and roughly the periods in which water is banked and then recovered. So this image here depicts essentially, it's a cross section of a groundwater basin up against the Sierra foothills, if you will, or bedrock geology. And it depicts the forms of recharge. Recharge is a very important part of how water is banked, and I'll touch on all the elements or the ways that water can be recharged here. One is natural recharge. So all groundwater really originated as surface water at one point. It just found its way into our groundwater basin or beneath our feet. And that really occurs mostly in the form of recharge at areas of streams and creeks. So as that surface water is flowing through our groundwater, above our groundwater basins, it finds its way and percolates down into our groundwater beneath our feet. Mountain front recharge, this isn't depicted as well in this image, but the contact between the bedrock geology and the basin, there's a lot of recharge that occurs right at that contact. That's called mountain front recharge. Surface water coming off the Sierra Nevadas, if you will, as it enters the valley floor of the Sacramento Valley in our region. And then rain, direct percolation. So obviously rain hits the ground surface, finds its way into the soil column, and works its way down into the groundwater basin. There are also forms of artificial recharge. So we, as water managers, can augment the amount of recharge that naturally occurs through artificial ways. There are really 2 forms of direct recharge. One is using injection wells. This image here, one of those wells showing arrows obviously going down into the groundwater basin, is a form of directly injecting surface water into our groundwater basin. There's also percolation ponds. This is actually a very cost-effective mechanism for recharging if you have the land to do it. Percolation ponds are obviously illustrated in this diagram. Essentially, that's berming up areas of land and flooding that land and allowing it to naturally percolate into the soil column. There's also in lieu recharge. Really, this is storing water by utilizing surface water in lieu of pumping groundwater. And this concept is another form of artificial recharge, very important for the Sacramento Regional Water Bank, which I'll touch on in a minute, because most of the recharge we're going to do with the bank is really in lieu recharge. And so what this means is when there's extra surface water, agencies that normally pump groundwater, even if there's extra surface water, will be taking that extra surface water off creeks or streams and not pumping groundwater and allowing that groundwater basin in lieu of pumping groundwater, and allowing that groundwater basin to recharge by not taking groundwater that they would normally have taken in those year types or during those periods. So this image here, a satellite image obviously of our region that we're in, the Sacramento region, really want to highlight a couple of different concepts and important features of our region. We often think about our region's water supply in terms of 3 reservoirs, even though they're not reservoirs per se in terms of the traditional definition like Folsom Reservoir, but we do think of these sources of supply as reservoirs in our region. One is the snowpack. The snowpack is very important, obviously, as it feeds our streams and creeks that flow into our surface water reservoirs, and as mentioned on the previous slide, also naturally recharge our groundwater basin. A snowpack, and especially in our region, that melts slowly over a long spring is beneficial because we don't have a lot of ability in terms of surface water reservoirs to capture a lot of that surface water. Our surface water reservoirs are relatively small in comparison to the size of our watershed. So we like to see a slow release of snowmelt so that we can kind of capture a lot of it, not have to release it in terms of flood flows. So we have the Sierra snowpack, which is thought of as a reservoir. We have actually, obviously, the surface water reservoirs in our region, Folsom Reservoir being the largest in the American River watershed. And then we have our groundwater basins. And those are also very important reservoirs. And our historic reliance on snowpack, surface water, and groundwater, as we move forward, especially with climate change, we really need to integrate additional groundwater storage because we're going to lose snowpack in the future and have less ability to capture that in our surface water reservoirs. We need to capture that in our groundwater basin, and that's what water banks can do, and I'll touch on that in more detail again with the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. Something else I want to highlight here is that we have enough unused storage space in our 2 groundwater basins here in the greater Sacramento region that equates to essentially twice the volume of Folsom Reservoir. We have an estimated 1.8 million acre feet of available storage space in our region to store additional water in our groundwater basins. And Folsom Reservoir is just under 1 million acre feet, so it's quite substantial, the amount of volume that we have in our groundwater system. So now we transition to the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. I'm going to touch on quite a few different elements of the bank. Highlight some preceding studies real quickly, talk a little bit about goals, objectives, and governance, some of the preliminary work we've been doing on this project with our program committee, which is a series of agencies. I'll highlight that. Just further describe the water bank area, touch a little bit on the water accounting system. As I mentioned on a couple of slides ago, having an accounting of water supplies and that you've stored is very important in terms of operating bank. Dive deeper into recharge and recovery and how that's going to look with the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. Talk a little bit about the existing facilities that we're going to use to implement the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. And it is important to highlight that everything we're talking about is existing facilities. We're not talking about adding facilities with the project as it's been defined. About how shifting between surface water and groundwater sources makes additional supply. And then I'll touch on some projects and conclusions, things that are not part of the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. So bear with me. Preceding studies. A lot of studies, different types of studies, highlighted the importance or showcased the need and the benefit of the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. So we have 4 documents shown here. The first one on your left, the Regional Water Reliability Plan. This was a study done in 2019 that really highlighted the potential of the Sacramento Regional Water Bank in terms of the volume that could be stored and later recovered. And I'll highlight in more details in a subsequent slide some of that preliminary analysis. The 2 documents in the center there, those are groundwater sustainability plans, one for the North American subbasin, one for the South American subbasin. Saw on that previous aerial imagery that there were 2 subbasins. And again, I'll touch on that when we get to the area. These groundwater sustainability plans are required by law based on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that were passed in 2014 and is implemented in 2015, these plans identify how groundwater is going to be managed sustainably in these two basins, but they also highlight projects and management actions that are needed to sustainably manage the basin, and the water bank and conjunctive use, which is a term I'll talk more about in a minute, are highlighted in these plans as two of the projects will help maintain sustainability for these basins. So we talked about the water bank, they're also highlighted in our groundwater sustainability plans. And then finally, American River Basin Study. This study was completed by water agencies in this region with the Bureau of Reclamation, the United States Bureau of Reclamation, really highlighted the potential impacts of climate change on our entire watershed in this region and identified mitigation measures that can be taken. And without those measures, we have some really significant impacts. And so one of the mitigation measures is the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. That study again identified and supported the need to offset the impacts of climate change is to increase our ability to recharge and store groundwater in those groundwater subbasins. So 4 important documents. We do have some poster boards, at least one on the American River Basin Study that kind of highlights some of the technical analysis if you're interested after the meeting. So this project, again, I mentioned I'm the project manager. We've been working with approximately 20 local water agencies in this region. They are the, we'll call the program committee. So I'm working on their behalf to implement this project. This project, one of the first things that we wanted to do was to be very transparent with the public and make sure that we're have a consistent vision for this project amongst these 20 agencies. And so we developed a document that's really just titled Goals, Objectives, Principles, and Constraints. And so the 2 boxes you see on your left, and I just wanted to share a little bit of what's in this document, identify the goal and the objectives for the water bank project. And I'm not going to read through all the objectives because they're pretty numerous, but there are important objectives to make sure that we're implementing this project and principles as well, consistent with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and to really make sure we're not creating any impacts in the region. But the goal is maybe really important to kind of highlight here, so let me read it real quickly. The goal of the water bank is to expand conjunctive use, thereby increasing water bank operations throughout the region. And this really has two benefits, if you will. One is to improve long-term regional reliability and provide statewide water supply opportunities when possible, and then also to support healthy ecosystem function on the Lower American River. And I'll explain again in subsequent slides how the water bank achieves these goals, or will achieve these goals in the future. On your right, you see a box with a really essentially a functional organizational structure for the water bank. And that is another document that we worked on up front, and that's how the agencies plan to coordinate and govern the implementation of the water bank. And so those 20 agencies I mentioned really will ultimately turn into participating agencies during implementation. And they are the agencies that make the water bank happen. They're actually the ones, obviously, that own the infrastructure and will be operating the water bank. And those agencies will identify a coordinating board that really is representatives from those agencies to make sure that when the bank is implemented, it's implemented consistent with the goals, objectives, principles that we identified in that other document I described. And one of these documents is on our website, the goals, objectives, principles, constraints. We will soon have the coordinating governing document also up on our website. But finally, let me round out the discussion about governance and coordinating is there will be another entity that will assist the participating agencies and the coordinating board working on their behalf to manage and implement the water bank. That agency has been identified at this point as the Regional Water Authority agency I work for, so we will have a role in ongoing implementation after the water bank gets established. All right, so the area of the water bank. The water bank is going to be within the North American and the South American subbasins. So the North American subbasin is delineated by the green outline there, and the South American subbasin by the orange outline. And so that North American subbasin includes parts of Sutter County, Placer County, and the uppermost portion of Sacramento County. It's a little hard to see, this map's pretty small, I apologize, but it's bound by the Bear River on the north, the Feather, dumps into the Sacramento on the west, the American River on the south, and then the contact of the groundwater basin, the Sierra foothills on that eastern side. So that's the boundaries of the North American subbasin. And then the South American subbasin, the boundaries are, of course, the American River on the north, the Sacramento River generally on the west, the Cosumnes River as it works its way down on the south, and then again, the boundaries of the foothills and the groundwater basin on the east, where the foothills hit the groundwater basin. So that's the boundary of the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. So water accounting is, again, as I mentioned, going to be very important for the purposes of keeping track of deposits, withdrawals, making sure we don't over-withdraw. In fact, there's mechanisms in place in terms of how the agencies want to implement the bank that preclude us from over-withdrawing stored water. And so this graphic that I'm going to walk you through explains in concept how the water bank is going to work. So imagine that there's already groundwater obviously beneath our feet in storage. And those water levels, if you drill down where you encounter groundwater, of course, depends, it's at different depths throughout the basin. There's various different reasons for that in terms of how deep you have to drill to encounter groundwater. In some cases, close to rivers, it might be not very far. In other areas of the basin, it may be hundreds of feet before you encounter groundwater. We call that the water table. It fluctuates. It also fluctuates not just because of spatial area, but it also fluctuates every year based on the amount of irrigation we get. Again, I mentioned natural recharge, rain. In dry years, we don't get as much natural recharge, obviously, because there's not as much precipitation and snow melts. And so groundwater levels can go down. And then in wet years, groundwater levels can go up because we get more precipitation and runoff. This is depicting kind of also fluctuations that occur just between spring and fall. We see just seasonal fluctuations of water levels just naturally going down. That again is a cycle of that recharge and how groundwater is used. So again, this is just conceptually, if you were to look at our groundwater basin, we have groundwater in storage, natural groundwater in storage. With the water bank, again, we're going to bank water, we're going to input surface water into the groundwater basin through a couple of different mechanisms. And that surface water really exists on top of the groundwater in storage. So it's going to establish in many areas a new water level. It's going to be physically on top of that. There is vast amounts, though, of groundwater beneath our feet. And so the surface water that we bank won't look exactly like this. It won't be perfectly uniform. It depends on where we're injecting it or doing in-lieu recharge. But essentially, that surface water that we're banking exists on top of the existing groundwater in storage. We'll also then be using that surface water that we just banked periodically. As mentioned, for those goals, that the goal that I laid out, we need that water for water resiliency, for our own resiliency at times. And so we'll take withdrawals from that stored surface water bank underground. The program committee, the agencies that I'm working on their behalf, have already come together and said, we need to think about leaving a certain percent of that surface water that we store in the groundwater regardless, and not use it just as an extra measure of sustainability to make sure that we're always never in a negative accounting, if you will, in terms of how we store surface water in our groundwater basin. So that's what's meant by that leave behind. There will be a small percent of water that will be stored and that will never be recovered, again, just to make sure that we're being sustainable and not ever overdrafting or overdrawing the amount of water that we bank. There are also losses, and this is it's very scientific very quickly, but when groundwater does not adhere to political boundaries, as you can imagine, it flows underground based on gradients to the lowest point. And so there is losses that can occur, or are occurring under our groundwater basin. Some of that groundwater may be moving to an adjacent groundwater basin outside of the boundaries that you saw in that map. And so we need to really understand what those losses are and recognize that those losses are water that we can't also recover. That's a certain amount of, as the name implies, that's a loss that we're just going to have to manage and obviously not withdraw because it will physically be gone. How we analyze that is really through groundwater modeling, and that work's just about to start here. So we don't really have a sense of how much water we're going to have potentially losses when we operate the Sacramento Regional Water Bank, but there will be some losses. And finally, I mentioned the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, adding kind of a third level of complexity here. And I mentioned those two documents in the center of that one slide, the groundwater sustainability plans. The groundwater sustainability plans identify a measurable objective and a minimum threshold throughout the basin at different depths. So it's not a single value, but the agencies, and the same agencies that are working on the bank are also working on those groundwater sustainability plans and implementing those. We're required not to go below the minimum threshold. So using existing groundwater and storage, agencies need to make sure that they're operating the basin in such a way that we're working towards that optimal water level, the measurable objective, and not working to operate groundwater levels at the minimum threshold. So it's a regulatory consideration that applies to how we look at banking water on top of the other losses and leave behind factors that I mentioned. So I'm sorry, it quickly gets kind of complicated in detail, and I'd be willing to talk through any questions you have on this afterwards, but it's very important that all of these considerations are factored into how we implement the Sacramento Regional Water Bank. So a little bit deeper dive then on recharge. And this is just another way of looking at those water levels. Sorry, it's a little different colors, so bear with me, but recharge, how the bank works is when there's excess surface water supplies in Folsom, in our surface water, American River and Sacramento River, we use that available, we use a very small portion of that excess surface water available during those wet years, if you will, during those hydraulically wet years, and we reduce the groundwater use. That's that in lieu. So agencies that have traditionally pumped groundwater during those periods, since there's extra surface water, why draw the groundwater basin down further? Take some of that extra surface water and let that groundwater basin naturally recover because you're not pumping that groundwater that you would have. We also have agencies that do direct recharge using what's called aquifer and storage and recovery wells. Right now, it's the city of Roseville. Other agencies are installing aquifer storage and recovery wells in our region. Another form of direct recharge, but this is taking extra surface water, piping it through their distribution system, injecting it, reversing the flow of wells. Traditional wells also pump groundwater, injecting it using that well into the aquifer, into the groundwater basin, and physically storing that extra surface water. And that's just another mechanism or tool we have to recharge our groundwater basin. So groundwater use would decrease and surface water use would increase. The analysis that we've looked at, the preliminary analysis, largely based on that one document I mentioned, the Regional Water Reliability Plan, identifies up to about 65,000 acre-feet a year of water can be banked in the groundwater basin just by reoperating existing facilities using those two recharge methods. So we can make an additional 65,000 acre-feet of water available, stored in our groundwater basin during those year types. So opposite how we obtain that water that we've stored underground is obviously recovery. Now recovery really happens only one way, that's pumping. The Regional Water Reliability Plan identified approximately 55,000 acre-feet of groundwater that was banked, could be relied upon in dry years when that surface water in our creeks and streams and rivers is really needed in those dry years in the creeks and streams. There really is no excess surface water. So we have the opportunity to lessen the amount of surface water that we take in those year types and pump that water that we've stored underground. So surface water could then be stored in Folsom Reservoir as well, or could be used for other purposes, such as ecosystem benefits, local agencies, for resiliency, and potentially other partners outside of this region. There is the opportunity to provide that stored water. It could be other partners that are storing their water in our basin, or our own agencies providing that water outside of our basin. So existing facilities, again, I mentioned this. This whole project is using existing facilities. Again, this map is a little small, I apologize. And again, the existing facilities are related to that recharge and recovery elements of the water bank. So when we're talking about diverting excess surface water supplies from the Sacramento and the American rivers, we're doing it at our existing water treatment plants, our existing diversion infrastructure. And those are identified in black text on this map. We have many existing treatment plants and diversion infrastructure here. So we're utilizing that infrastructure for either in lieu or direct recharge using aquifer storage and recovery. The recovery side, again, I mentioned really, the recovery side really only happens with wells. There are too many wells here to kind of show easily on this map, but the agencies have many wells in this region. Utilizing the existing wells, again, we could recover up to 55,000 acre-feet during dry years, utilizing that infrastructure when we go to the recovery side of operations. So how did we get to this analysis, and how did these numbers really kind of come about? Again, these graphics, not the exact graphics, but the numbers are identified in that Regional Water Reliability Plan. And essentially, how we looked at this is, you see two bar charts here. So again, we're diverting excess surface water in wet years when there's a plentiful amount of surface water. And then in dry years, we're looking at utilizing that water that we've banked and recovering it with wells. And so the first bar you see here is, we looked at the wet years on record, some of the most recent wet years on record, and we averaged 3 wet years, 2011 through 2013. And we noticed that the agencies in our region to meet demands were utilizing 69% in wet years to meet demand, they were utilizing surface water. And the other 31% to meet demand was met by groundwater. With dry years, it shifted a little bit, but not much. We noticed in dry year, we used year 2015, that's a great dry year on record, that agencies to meet demand utilized 64% of to meet demand was met by surface water, and 36% was met by groundwater. Now, there was a reduced amount of water used in a dry year because of conservation measures that were put in place. And obviously, we all feel those when those happen, reducing outdoor water use and such. So those efforts were occurring, and that's why in a wet year, you can see it was just above, these agencies collectively used just above 350,000 acre feet a year of water, combination of surface and groundwater. And in a dry year, they used just above 250,000 acre feet. So 100,000 acre foot reduction due to conservation during that dry year. But what's fascinating about this study is, again, with existing infrastructure, if agencies work together, that agencies during wet years could actually meet demands with 64% of their demand met by surface water and 14% by groundwater. And why is that so important, of course, is that, as I mentioned, agencies that were typically on groundwater in wet years, drawing the groundwater supplies, they could take surface water when there's excess supply and allow in the recharge, or those agencies that could inject using aquifer storage and recovery could take that excess surface water and meet demands utilizing excess surface water. So that is a significant shift, and that's what creates that 65,000 acre feet of volume. Just that shift between 69% groundwater, surface water, to 84% surface water, that represents that 65,000 acre feet of water that could be banked in our groundwater basins. So in dry years, we want to do a little bit of the opposite. We want to shift that the other way. In dry years, we want to leave some of that precious surface water in our streams and creeks for environmental and other needs. In the dry years, we can tap into that water that we banked and shift now from 64% surface water to 41% surface water and pump more groundwater. But again, it's groundwater that we've stored. It's that groundwater that we've deposited in those wet years. So it's a shifting between being focused more on surface water or groundwater to increase groundwater banking, and this is how that occurs. And so the 64 to 41%, again, that difference equates to about 55,000 acre feet. And that's how we got to that number in terms of how much can be recovered. Final slide here, project exclusions. So I mentioned existing facilities. New facilities are not being proposed, nor would any new facility be authorized as part of this project. We're not changing surface water rights. Contract supplies are not being proposed, nor would it be authorized as part of this project. Out-of-basin transfers are not currently being proposed as part of this project. So those are just some important exclusions. Federal acknowledgement, I just have one slide on this, I believe. One of the reasons to do the Sacramento Regional Water Bank is to get it acknowledged by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And the importance of that, it provides agencies flexibility. We can bank Central Valley project supplies, which are regulated really by the Bureau of Reclamation, outside of the place of use of our agencies or those agencies. So we have much more flexibility to take CVP, Central Valley project supplies, and bank them. So there's a series of requirements or guidelines that the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation has for acknowledged water banks. And so we're going to work to make sure that we submit an application that includes all of the requirements so that the Bureau of Reclamation can grant us the acknowledgement of being federally recognized. Again, provides a lot of flexibility for how we are able to bank water. But what I want to highlight here is that there are already 11 acknowledged federally acknowledged water banks throughout the state of California. They're all really in the lower San Joaquin Valley, or the middle to the lower San Joaquin Valley. A lot of them do direct recharge using surface spreading. Some of them do in lieu, but they have a slightly different process of recharging water. So the Sacramento Regional Water Bank will be the first federally acknowledged water bank north of the Delta. So we're pretty excited about that opportunity and establishing it in our region. All right, thanks for bearing through all of that. I'm going to hand it back over to Heather to take us through the environmental process.
Thanks. So again, the reason we're here tonight, we're in the process of kicking off the environmental impact report. RWA, or the Regional Water Authority, is the lead agency under the California Environmental Quality Act, also known as CEQA. RWA has determined that the project should be evaluated using an environmental impact report, or EIR is commonly acronymed. So the notice of preparation was issued on September 25th, and we are in the middle of the scoping process. We've also initiated consultation with Native American tribes that may have an interest in the project area. So we've contacted Native American tribes that are traditionally located or have an interest in the North and South American subbasins. CEQA guidelines recommend that a wide variety of different resources are evaluated in the environmental process. We've taken a very, very high-level preliminary review of what the potential impacts may be as a result of implementation of the project. And we have kind of narrowed down to the following resources: biological resources, energy, greenhouse gases, hydrology and water quality, population and housing, recreation, tribal cultural resources, and utilities and service systems. This doesn't mean that the other resources won't be evaluated as part of the CEQA process. It just means that these are the kind of the areas that we're expecting to see some level of change, not necessarily negative change, but just some level of change nonetheless. So this is what we're expecting to see, but again, we're very, very preliminarily starting in the environmental review process. So I want to touch a little bit on why scoping is so important. First of all, early public consultation is useful for discovering overlooked resources. Maybe there's an agency or a member of the public or a tribe that has information that's not readily available through public avenues or through public online information or published information, and so it's a good opportunity for us to understand, what are the issues or areas that we really want to make sure that we don't overlook. Scoping also helps identify ranges of alternatives to a project which may lessen or eliminate potential environmental effect that would otherwise occur due to implementation of a project. It also helps us eliminate issues that may not be important. Maybe we're identifying areas that really wouldn't be impacted by the project. And it's also, a good way to, sorry, unable to back up. It's also a good way to identify resource agencies that may have an interest in the project, a responsible agency that may also need to issue a permit or some kind of other authorization for the project. So zooming through to the environmental review process. Again, we are in the early stages, in the middle of scoping. Once we've completed scoping, we'll take all public comments or information that we've obtained through the scoping process and begin preparation of the draft EIR. Once that's completed and we've finished, as Trevor mentioned, the modeling that will look at the potential impacts from implementation of the project, we'll prepare the EIR and release it for public review. And that will be another opportunity for the public to understand the project effects, and make comments about the content of the EIR or the, just the general details about the project. Once the public review period is completed, after release of the draft EIR, we'll consider all of those comments, determine if any additional analysis is needed or revisions to the document are required in order to, provide meaningful information for decision makers once the decision is to implement the project or adopt the EIR. The final EIR will also be released for public review prior to the RWA board making a decision on whether to or not to implement the project. And so just giving you an idea of what to expect over the next couple of years, the timeline of the analysis and environmental review process is expected to take about 2 years. After, again, we've completed scoping, we'll begin the modeling and the analysis, and then we're expecting to release the draft EIR for public review at the end of next year. We'll likely have another public meeting to accept comments on the EIR, and then once that's completed, we'll consider all of those comments and prepare a final EIR for RWA board consideration prior to making a decision on the project. And of course, this schedule shows project implementation would be accomplished in early 2026, and the project would move forward, but that is subject to determination by the RWA board. But I also want to emphasize that the environmental review process isn't the only opportunity for public involvement. RWA has conducted and intends to continue conducting public stakeholder forums. Those are yearly, generally in the fall time period, and so that's an opportunity for the public to engage with RWA and learn more about the water bank and other activities that RWA has going on. So now we're at the point where we invite the public, you guys, to provide comments. If you have a clarifying question or would like to just get a little bit more information on any of the detail that Trevor touched on or the environmental review process, we're happy to answer those questions. So I see we have one comment, and but before we initiate that, I just wanted to let everyone know there's multiple avenues to comment about the project. Tonight is not your only option. We of course are taking comments tonight, but we have comment cards that are self-addressed, so you can submit a comment by mail. Email is also another great way of submitting comments. We just ask that all comments are submitted by October 25th of this year. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and see what we have here, and then once we've completed that, we can open it up for additional questions, clarifying. There's some posters in the back and some information sheets that you can take home with you if you want to kind of think about the project a little bit more and before you're ready to make your comment.